Welcome to this Proms at Home event. Proms at Home is free, but we'd love to raise money for two wonderful charities, Toynbee Hall and the North London Hospice. Like all charities, their income streams have been adversely affected by COVID-19. Please consider donating at the end of today's event. Now, let me introduce myself and this first Proms at Home 2020 Heritage Walk. I am Kate Webster. I'm a board member of Proms at St Jude's and coordinate the Heritage Walks. Some of you will also know me as the Friends Coordinator. This walk is an updated and expanded version, now in two parts, of one which I led last year. This version of the walk is intended for you to follow in person as you walk around the suburb. There is another version on our website with photographs of the people and places which you might want to look at afterwards. There is also a second part to the walk in both formats which will be available a week after the first one. The idea for the walk started with some work I did as part of a team from the Hampstead Garden Suburb Archive Trust to analyse returns from the 1911 census. I am especially grateful to Janice Blackstaff, who did the detailed analysis of Hampstead Way and Willeyfield Way and shared some ideas for my original walk in 2019. Today we will start on Central Square. Although this first walk will focus mainly on the oldest part of the suburb, known as the Artisan's Quarter, and particularly the first people who made their homes here. First, a few words about the 1911 census. This was nationally important. It was the first time forms were completed by householders themselves. You can see your ancestors' forms online, completed in their own handwriting. It collected new data for government planning, which allowed inferences to be drawn about subjects such as infant mortality, fertility and crowding. The census also coincided with the women's suffrage campaign and was boycotted by some suffrage groups. More of that later. For Hampstead Garden Suburb, it offers the only snapshot of the early suburb and its residents before the massive upheavals of the First World War. The suburb was still being built. The first land had been purchased from Eton College in 1906, and the Hampstead Garden Suburb Act was passed by Parliament in the same year. Raymond Unwin's first plans were drawn up in 1905, though the layout was modified several times over the next few years. Building started in 1907, and good progress was made, but many roads were no more than lines on the map or were only partially built by early 1911. Our first stop is Central Square itself. Building was underway on Central Square, which had been planned as the centre point of the suburb. The first small part of the Institute building had opened in 1909. It was the hall, but is unrecognisable today as there is a more recent facade. The churches and the houses on North Square were under construction, but there were only 3 residents in Central Square itself. The resident Basil Borchier rattled around in the 14-room vicarage with only one female general servant, a Mary Holland, for company, whilst the only other resident was Mr. Nelson Edward Davis, the caretaker at the Institute, who lives in a 2-room flat. Now, leave Central Square and walk to the right, via North Square and onto Erskine Hill, to our next stop at the junction of Erskine Hill and Temple Fortune Hill. Here we are at the junction of Erskine Hill with Temple Fortune Hill. At the time of the census, the view at this point would have been very different. The houses between the junction and Bigwood were not here. Neither were those on the Bigwood side of the upper part of Erskine Hill, whilst those on the opposite side, which were designed by Lutyens, were under construction. However, the views down to Temple Fortune and down Erskine Hill would have been similar today, albeit that the street trees and other vegetation would have been much more sparse. However, Erskine Hill was much shorter than today, ending at the current junction with Asman's Hill. What does the census tell us in general terms about Erskine Hill in 1911? Well, the houses were very new. Some had names, some had plot numbers, and others had street numbers. They were different on each side of the road as the houses were built by different building companies. All of the homes were rented. The rents were about 21 shillings a week, or £1.05 in today's money. This sounds very little, with its equivalent of £119 a week being much less than rent on these properties today. However, in 1910, the average salary was £70 for men and £30 per women per year for a 55-hour working week. Of the 63 houses, 62 were occupied on census night. They were predominantly terraced houses in groups of 4. More than half were 3-bedroomed cottages. Similarities in housing size led to other similarities in terms of family size and socio-economic status. As in other roads in the Artisan's quarter, servants were rare. Only 3 homes boasted a servant on census night. Most households, 88%, consisted of married couples, typically a male head of household as the main breadwinner and a non-working mother with school-age children. Often these were fairly new or expanding family units. The exceptions were 3 widows, 1 widower and 2 single men. Just over half of all households, 55%, had a child under 16. The average family size was 1.87 children. There were very few old people. In fact, only 4 were over 65, of whom 2 were visitors. The average age of residents was 28.7 years. This was relatively young, but similar to many other roads in the suburb. We now walk down Erskine Hill and enter Chatham Close on the right-hand side. We are interested in number 5, which is in the corner at the right-hand side of the close. The inhabitants of this house were noteworthy in the census because they refused to complete the census form as part of the boycott of the census organised by some of the women's suffrage groups. This was the home of Mrs. Fairfield and her 2 daughters. Their census form was completed by the census officer following a visit. He wrote on the form, "Enumerator informed by Mrs. Fairfield that she intended avoiding the census." He has also written, "Fairfield, approximately 30, married or widow." Initially, 2 females and 2 persons were recorded on the form, but this was later amended in red by the enumerator to 5 and 5. He added as follows, "Particulars based on a personal call at Fairley Hope and inserted by instruction of the Registrar General." It is probable that he spoke not to Mrs. Fairfield, who was born in 1853, but more likely to Letty, or Josephine Letitia Denny Fairfield, born in 1885, who was training to be a doctor. At the time, she was a member of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragette movement founded by the Pankhursts, from which she later resigned. Later, she was to become the first ever female Chief Medical Officer for London, as well as a prominent Fabian and feminist. Her younger sister was Cicely Fairfield, born in 1892 and known as Cissy. She was to become better known under her pen name of Rebecca West. She had been involved with selling suffrage newspapers and in suffrage street protests since her early teens. Now return to Erskine Hill, and just before reaching Denman Drive, pause outside 34 Erskine Hill, which is on the right-hand side. This was the home of one of the most interesting inhabitants. George Montague Elwood describes himself on the census return as a book designer and employer. However, his skills were much broader than this. He studied at Holloway's School of Art and later in Paris, Berlin, Dresden and Vienna. His furniture designs won a gold medal in a national competition at the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A. At the turn of the century, he was designing furniture in the Art Nouveau and arts and crafts styles. His designs were exhibited at the 1900 Paris exhibition, with one winning a silver medal. From 1912 to 1914, he designed posters for London Transport, some of which are still available. Later, he was to write books and edit journals on drawing, design, and related fields. He also exhibited as an artist, including at the Royal Academy. We now move on to the junction with Denman Drive. Turn right here and pause in front of number 8, which is on the right-hand side. Not all suffrage supporters were opposed to the census, and in this road lived two women who worked for the Women's Labour League and other socialist groups. They were committed to widening the vote to women, but also to men, without any property qualification. They were in favour of accurate completion of the census as a basis for the planning of future social provision. One of these women was Margaret Bomfield. She was already prominent in socialist circles, for example as the first female delegate to the TUC or Trades Union Congress. In the 1920s, she was to become the first female chair of the General Council of the TUC, and she and two others were the very first female Labour MPs to enter Parliament at the election of December 1923. In 1929, she was to become the first female Cabinet Minister and Privy Councillor, serving as Minister of Labour. Now return to Erskine Hill and turn to the right. As might be expected from the rents, many of the residents were already in professional and white-collar roles. However, about half of the householders might have been described as artisans, a worker in a skilled trade, especially one that involves making things by hand. There were also a number of less skilled roles, such as postal sorter. A number of families had one or more older working children in the household. Amongst these were the largest families in the road, where the unmarried adult children were still living at home and often employed in the artisan-type trades. For example, the Earthy family at number 41 had 7 daughters, all of whom lived in the family home. They ranged in age from 25 to 11. The older 5 girls were all in employment, and the 2 youngest were still at school. Mr. Earthy was a pianoforte maker, and presumably the daughters who worked, mainly in dressmaking, would have been able to supplement the family income. Similarly, the Cooper family at 76 also had 5 of their 7 adult children living with them. All were single females, aged between 27 and 17, and in employment, variously as tie makers, machinists, and telephonists. Mr. Cooper was a bricklayer and may well have been working on the building of the suburb. The Frost family at 65 also had 4 adult children at home. They were 3 males and 1 female, and ranged in age from 28 to 18, all working as upholsterers like their father. At the time of the census, the developed area of Erskine Hill ended at its junction with Aspen's Hill. Here we can make an optional deviation which will take 12 to 15 minutes depending on your speed of walking. Turn onto the lower part of Erskine Hill and proceed to the Twitton on the left-hand side, which is signposted to Coleridge Walk. Coleridge Walk was still being completed at the time of the census, and almost 2/3 of the houses were unoccupied on census night. It was designed by architect Herbert Welch, whose home we will see later. Now continue down Coleridge Walk, and at the bottom turn to the left onto Addison Way, and make your way to the junction with Hogarth Hill. We pause here at the bottom of Hogarth Hill to look at number 38 on the left-hand side. This was the home of Edith Hal Martin and her husband Herbert Hal Martin. Edith was prominent in the women's suffrage movement and appears on the plinth of the recent Millicent Fawcett statue erected in Parliament Square in 2018. She was one of the first suffragettes to be imprisoned in 1906 for trying to make a speech in the House of Commons. This was one of the first acts of suffragette militancy. She left the WSPU later and was a co-founder of the Women's Freedom League, WFL. This was still a militant suffragette organisation, but only advocated non-violent illegal acts. As editor of The Vote, the WFL newspaper, she initiated disruption of the 1911 census. She wrote, "To boycott the census, to refuse all information about themselves and their households. We intend to do our best to make it unreliable and inaccurate." The WSPU joined the campaign later. Number 38 did not complete the census form, but Edith wrote, "No votes for women, no information from women. Legislation without representation is slavery. The occupier of this house is not a person, only a woman. See decision of the House of Lords Scottish Graduates case of 1908. The enumerator inserted additional information in red by authorisation of the Registrar General, stating, "Information received that this was an open house on census night. Herbert Hal Martin," which he spelt wrongly, "head, approx 40, married, scientific man. Mrs. Hal Martin, 6 female visitors." So, an open house accommodated women who were staying somewhere other than at home to avoid registration in the census. Later, Edith Hal Martin was to become the first female member of Middlesex County Council in 1919, and she also organised the first children's play centre in Hampstead Garden Suburb. She was a campaigner for birth control, and in 1927 organised the World Population Conference and was director of the Birth Control Information Centre. She died in Australia in 1954. Now proceed up Hogarth Hill. At the time of the census, the right-hand side of the road was not built. On the left you will pass Wordsworth Walk. Like much of the area, it was obviously recently completed and occupied, and could have been called Honeymoon Walk, since an astonishing 50% of the households had been married 1 year or less. One of its inhabitants, at number 15, on the left-hand side as you walk up the road, was opposed to women's suffrage. Mrs. Gladys Cowper Solomon records herself as the organising secretary of the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. As an alternative to walking to the top of Hogarth Hill, you can turn up Wordsworth Walk and return to Willowfield Way via the Twitton before the last group of houses on the right. Now stop on Willowfield Green. We are standing opposite the site of today's Fellowship House, which in 1911 was occupied by a much larger predecessor building, the Hampstead Garden Suburb Social Club. This was destroyed by bombing during the Second World War. Charles Henshaw, the steward employed by Hampstead Garden Suburb Company, lived here with his family. Willowfield Way as a whole had quite a mixture of styles and sizes of house, but the small houses were often inhabited by artisans or even less skilled working people. For example, the 5 three-roomed cottages, now in the upper part of Asmon's Hill, but then called Willowfield Cottages, had accommodated 2 householders who were compositors or printers, a museum attendant, a pianoforte maker, and a contract gardener. Now turn to the right and proceed down Asmon's Hill towards Temple Fortune. On this road, the residents were again a mix of professionals, artisans and other workers, mainly skilled. Pause at number 28, Aspen's Hill, which is on the left-hand side of the road. Here we find another spoilt census form. Details are given for the householder, Mr. John Bartram, a mantle manufacturer and agent, and their child. Clearly, Mr. Bartram filled in some of the form, but it has then been overwritten in red by his wife. She was Doris Mary Bartram, and a female friend was also visiting. The ages of both are withheld. The servant is named only as Kate. Doris Bartram was on the roll of honour of suffragette prisoners. She wrote on the form, "Voteless women of the household only prevented by illness from evading the census, therefore have refused to give information to occupier." Those working on the building of the suburb were very much in evidence, occupying about 1 in 6 of the houses, ranging from Herbert Welsh, one of the suburb's major architects who lived at number 1 Aspen's Hill, which is at the bottom on the right-hand side, to bricklayers, other architects and architects' assistants, as well as associated trades such as quantity surveyors, works managers and gardeners. We now leave Aspen's Hill and turn right, walking a short distance to Aspen's Place, again on the right-hand side. As we go, notice the pair of foundation cottages at 140 and 142 Hampstead Way. These were the first houses to be completed in Hampstead Garden suburb. 142 also bears a plaque commemorating the official visit of the Lord Mayor of London to open the houses and the garden suburb. In 1911, 142 was inhabited by John Albert Ellard, who was a builder's foreman for the co-partnership tenants, one of the companies who were building in the Artisan's Quarter. Aspen's Place is soon found on the right-hand side. We will not be looking at specific homes, but if you have time, it is well worth exploring to look at the variety of architectural details. For example, the entrances to the central passages in the 4 house terraces have beautiful tile detailing, and some of the cottages at the top of the road overlooking the green have wooden shingles on the gables. Do not miss the faded plaque on the first tree on the left-hand side of the road. The tree was planted by Henrietta Barnett in October 1907 to mark the opening of the first house in the suburb by the Lord Mayor of London, which we have just seen. Aspen's Place was perhaps the road with the highest proportion of artisans and truly working-class people living in it. The houses are mainly small 4-roomed cottages. There were only a couple of professional roles represented, a female teacher and an engineer. There was a good number of white-collar roles, predominantly clerks, in a range of workplaces, but skilled artisan jobs were in a clear majority. Some were related to the building of the suburb, but there were many others, some of which have almost disappeared today, such as wood engraver, spectacle maker, wheelwright, boot maker, optical glazier, carver of wooden frames, athletic woodworker, which was a maker of sporting bats. As in many of the roads, there were a number of printers and compositors, a very common trade at the time. Another notable feature of these households was that almost half had 2 wage earners, most frequently adult children in employment, sometimes a lodger, often working on the building of the suburb, or occasionally unmarried siblings living together. This is a strong indication that although aiming to be a suburb for all classes, rents, even of the smallest houses, were not affordable to all. Another strong similarity between the residents of Aspen's Place was that almost all of the heads of household had been born in the London area. This was also a feature of a number of other roads in the Artisan quarter, but varied according to house size and, by implication, the cost of the rent. We now return to Hampstead Way. Cross the road and walk away from Finchley Road around the front of Queen's Court, which wasn't built until the 1920s. As you go, glance across to the entrance of the orchard. The original buildings of the orchard were a 2-storey quadrangle of 57 one-room flats for the elderly. These buildings were demolished in the 1970s. Not surprisingly, the residents of the orchard were much older than average, predominantly female, widows and usually retired. This was part of the provision for all classes, in line with the vision of Henrietta Barnett. Now, pause at the end of Temple Fortune Hill. In 1911, the view to the back of Arcade House, which fronts Finchley Road and was completed in 1909, would have been much more open, interrupted only by the builder's yard. Photographs from the period show that this was a repository for windows and other materials during the building of the suburb. There were also 2 farm cottages here, although the precise location is unknown. Number 1 farm cottages was occupied by Charles Sibley, whose census entry describes him as a horsekeeper, delivering builders' materials for Hampstead Garden Suburb. He also had a wife and 3 children. There were also 3 boarders. 2 were labourers unloading builders' carts, and 1 was a carman transporting builders' materials. Similarly, 2 farm cottages housed 8 people. The householder was Arthur Abrahams, also recorded as a horsekeeper, and the industry, builders' materials. 2 boarders were carmen, again responsible for transporting builders' materials around the suburb. We now pass round onto the lower part of Hampstead Way, and I would like you to stop outside 219 Hampstead Way. This is our final stop. Here we're going to look at number 219 and 221 Hampstead Way. These 2 houses were another corner of census resistance. At 219 lived Miss Kelsall. She was the householder and wrote, "No vote, no census." The enumerator's note states that there were 6 suffragist overnight guests. In other words, this was another open house for evaders of the census. Next door was 221 Hampstead Way, the home of Miss Jessie Wade. Here the form appears to have been filled in by a Beatrice Le Mesurier, who was a boarder and recorded her age as 25. She gives us her occupation, suffragette, unwaged Women's Freedom League. She also originally wrote unenfranchised in the final column, which was headed disabilities, but this was subsequently crossed out. No vote, no census is again written across the form. The enumerator has written in additional information in red ink. All information refused. Householder, Miss Wade, 40, ? He alters Beatrice's age to 30 and writes that normally 3 women were resident. He also writes, open house for suffragettes, 8 additional women recorded, total occupancy 10. Miss Jessie Wade was later to come to prominence as the founder of the Cats Protection League and a number of other animal charities. We now look back on the walk as a whole. So, did the Artisan's Quarter merit its name? There was undoubtedly a good proportion of artisans living in the area in this brief period before the start of World War I, although it is also clear from the street directories that there was quite a high turnover in the rented homes, and this was higher in the artisans' quarter than elsewhere as the suburb developed. This may be a reflection of the relatively high rents, but also that some of the residents would have moved on as the building of the suburb was completed. In 1911, there were numerous households who had members employed directly in building the suburb or as employees of the Garden Suburb Company in roles such as gardeners. The dominant employment groups reflected the labour-intensive nature of many trades at the time, for example, printing. Similarly, there was a variety of trades involved in high-quality furniture manufacture, such as marquetry, furniture glass cutting, wood carving, as well as much more numerous upholsterers and stuffers. The frequency of piano ownership is also hinted at by a good number of pianoforte makers. Other employment reflected the changing nature of the area. For example, underground train drivers and greasers from the depot at Golders Green. Others were clearly employed in central London as museum attendants, including at Madame Tussauds and at the law courts. One of the largest employers was the General Post Office. All roads in the Artisans' Quarter seemed to have at least a scattering of sorters and other GPO employees. Administration was also labour-intensive at the time, and probably the largest single group of people were employed as clerks in a wide variety of settings, from manufacturing, banking and insurance to other service industries and local and national government. All in all, this was very different to the national picture, where mining, farming and textiles were still by far the biggest employment sectors. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you will all have learnt something about the suburb and its first residents in the Artisans' Quarter. I hope that you might also wish to join me on the second walk, which will start where this one finishes, and look at a wider range of roads and housing types as we follow Hampstead Way and turnings off it beside the Hampstead Heath extension. You can find other events in this special Proms at Home season, including concerts, Litfest talks, family events and self-guided walks on our website. I hope that we'll also be able to meet in person at next year's Proms Festival in June 2021. Don't forget, we are raising money for our beneficiary charities, Toynbee Hall and the North London Hospice. Every penny we raise will go to them, so if you'd like to donate, please go to our website and click on our virtual donation bucket. Thank you and goodbye.